Good afternoon and welcome to today's Electricity Enquiry Services webinar. I'd just like to introduce myself, which is Teresa Thompson, and I'll be your facilitator for the event today. Before we begin, you might notice that your camera and microphone is automatically switched off and muted. That's because we do have a high number and it just sort of gives, minimises the disruption and also helps with connection today. Please raise any of the questions. You'll notice that we're via Slido. If you look at the codes, if I just quickly go back to the entrance, just to make sure, because obviously people are still joining. So the code is 1132904. That should also be in the chat function as well. And obviously this meeting is being recorded and we'll also make it available along with the presentation and the recording after the event. So your speakers today, we have John Hawkins, who's our Interim Director of Operations and Programmes, and Johnny Moore, who's the Market Half Hourly Settlement Delivery Manager, who'll be giving the overview of the presentation today for you. Just to provide some context, so the aims and objectives of today really is to provide an overview of those changes being made to the Electricity Enquiry Services as part of the Market Half Hourly implementation. And it's to go through and highlight some of the changes and the impact of the user systems and processes. And some of that will be showing you some of the screenshots of before and after and what to expect, what the changes are for you to see in those systems. And obviously an opportunity for stakeholders to sort of ask questions regarding any changes of the EES Market Half Hourly programme. So if we look at the agenda, so we'll start with the Market Half Hourly background and context, which will give you an overview of the target operating model, looking at the context of the changes on the Market Half Hourly design, along with the overview of the Enquiry Services changes. And then Johnny will take you through the physical changes within the system for the GUI and the user portal, the API changes, EES reporting, and looking at the delivery plan. And then what we'll do is we'll open it up then for the Q&A session for you to answer questions. So again, please submit any questions that you have via Slido, and then we'll look to summary, close, and next steps. So with that in mind, I'd like to introduce you to Jonathan Hawkins, who will be taking you through his changes now. Thanks, John.
Thanks, Teresa. Okay, if we can go to the next slide, please. And again, so I'm John Hawkins, and I'm responsible for the delivery of the MHHS programme and other operational programmes at RECO. What I'm going to do, I'm going to take you through a bit of the background of the context to why we need to make changes to the inquiry service and leading into what those changes are, and then Johnny's going to take you through the details of those. Now, I assume the majority of people on the call are familiar with the market-wide half-hourly settlement programme by now, but just for those who don't, and for a refresher, this came from a significant code review that was launched by Ofgem back in 2017, and the objectives of that were to consider the opportunity presented by smart meters to look at how we can make the settlement process more accurate and timely, and how that can act as an enabler for new products and services and in support the delivery of net zero. In 2021, Ofgem published their decision to implement half-hourly settlement on a market-wide basis. And by doing so, they agreed to implement the target operating model that was developed and recommended by the Elexon-led design working group. And within that, they established a governance framework that set up the MHHS programme, with Elexon in the role as senior responsible owner and implementation manager for that programme. And within that governance framework, they introduced a number of obligations on programme participants to support the delivery of that, RECO being one of those, and a clause was implemented into the REC, clause 5.25, which obliges RECO to comply with the requirements of the MHHS programme set out in BSc section C12. And so as a result of this, RECO has mobilised our own internal programme to deliver against these requirements, with the objective of identifying and delivering all of the required changes to the retail energy market relating to MHHS. So I mentioned that that in the decision there was a decision to implement the target operating model developed by the design working group. And I'm not going to go through this in significant detail. The MHHS programme have some really good training material on this on their website. So if anyone's interested in that, we'll make the link available when the slides go out, so you can go and review that. But just setting the context, the implementation of MHHS is all stemming from the implementation of this model. And what the working group did is they developed a number of services, some of which mirror existing services in the current settlement process, that would be required to measure energy consumption all the way through to taking that and settling that on a half-hourly basis across the market. And that's regardless of the type of metering. So they introduced the concept of market segments, whereby we will distinguish between metering points based on whether they are smart meters, non-smart / traditional meters, advanced meters or AMR, and unmetered supplies. There will be distinct services responsible for the management of the metering, the retrieval of data and the processing of that data to pass that through to central settlements. And there will be a registration service delivered by the meter point registration service today, responsible for managing the relevant standing data and settlement parameters for each metering point. What that means for RECO and what that means for the EES is that the implementation of this model changes a lot of the data landscape. So it changes the users that operate in the market. It uses changes the data items that are recorded against metering points, and therefore that would all filter through to the EES in some way. Slide, please. So what the MHHS programme have done is they've taken that target operating model and they've taken it to the next level down, and they've developed an end-to-end design. And that end-to-end design sets out in more detail the business processes, the requirements on individual participants and their businesses, the technical and non-functional requirements, the security standards, how systems will interface with each other, and the relevant definitions of data flows and data items. Along with the target operating model, this included the implementation of a new event-driven architecture and a new communications network called the Data Integration Platform, or the DIP, has been introduced to support the implementation of this model. And the vast majority of industry data flows to support MHHS are going to utilise that network for communication going forwards. So if we move on, there are 4 broad areas. When we take all of that and we assess what that means for the inquiry service, there are 4 broad areas that impact on the inquiry service. The first is, I mentioned there's changes to data items. Where there are new data items relevant to the meter point or the MPAN, some of those need to be reflected in the inquiry service to support user switching journeys and other requirements that users have for that. Where there are existing data items that have been amended, there's a need to reflect that in the system. And some of those data items are no longer relevant and have been superseded and therefore should be removed. And an example of that is that in MHHS, there will no longer be the concept of a data aggregator role. Therefore, there would be no need to continue to record a data aggregator. We have new user roles to reflect. So some of these new services coming in don't exist in the market today, or there are variants that don't reflect the current versions in the market. They may and probably will need to access the inquiry service to support their business, so we need to reflect that. And then we mentioned the event-driven architecture, and one of the requirements that came out of the detailed design of the programme was asked to move to near real-time updates to data. And what we mean by that is moving away from the current model of updating all of the data in the inquiry service in a batch process overnight to having that updated at the point in time. E.g., if it's updated at 2 p.m, then there would be an expectation that would be reflected soon after that and not waiting until 6 a.m. the next day. And finally, we need to be able to accommodate the way in which these metering points will be migrated to MHHS. And there's also been a decision to allow these to reverse migrate in certain cases where on a switch it can revert back to legacy arrangements where it's previously been in MHHS arrangements, and the inquiry service needs to be able to support both the forward migration to MHHS and the potential migration back to legacy, and then back and forward again as necessary. So the bit of background I'm going to give you before Johnny covers the other aspects in details is I mentioned the need to move to more real-time processing of data, and that's probably been the most significant impact to the system. It's the part that most users don't see, the stuff that happens behind the scenes, but it's the most significant in terms of a technical change. And when we look at that, there were a number of options that came up on how that could possibly be done. And we looked at those and we set out those options. We assessed them to find the best value and future-proof solution for this. So today, each distribution network operator or DNO sends a batch file via their meter point registration service to the inquiry service for updates overnight, and that gets updated in a batch. So you could just speed that process up and try and do that faster and use a different way to do that, and that would require individual interfaces with each of those 20 plus DNOs to be updated and managed going forwards. There was also the option of looking at sourcing the data directly from the new data integration platform, and there were some benefits to that, in that was a single source that the inquiry service would need to interface with and manage and maintain that interface going forwards. It would reduce the level of change required for each DNO, and it potentially opens up future data items to the service if and when they were required, without requiring DNOs to have to change their systems. So we looked at each of those, and we also considered whether there was a variant to interfacing directly with the DIP, and whether using an adapter service would make that more efficient. The decision we came to, if we go to the next slide, is that we went with the option to integrate directly with the DIP. And the reason for this was that when we looked at it, whilst on initial thinking, speeding up what you do today always sounds the simplest and the most cost effective, implementing those changes with each individual DNO and maintaining that on an ongoing basis proved to really not be cost effective, and moving away from that model to a single source to interface directly with the new communications network is a much simpler solution with lower complexity and a greater certainty in the design, because that design's already been done by the program. We don't have to go off and design a brand new interface to then implement on top of that. It reduces the delivery risk through the management of a single service provider, and by interfacing with the DIP, it potentially supports future innovation, because I mentioned before, if there are data items available on that network that users want to see in the inquiry service, then from a technical standpoint, it's much easier to make those available without changing end user systems. Whereas under the current arrangements, you would have to change either the DNO systems or the CSS systems, which is why we've gone forward with that solution. And that was all I was going to cover. Hopefully that's given a bit of background to where we've come from and how we've got to where we are. And I'll hand over to Johnny now to take you through the detail of what that means for you.
Thanks, John. Afternoon all. So I'm going to run through some detail of what a user is going to see when they access either the EES user portal or the API. So firstly, we have a number of data items, as John was saying, that will be added or even removed from the EES. There's a few themes here that I'll run through. I won't go through all the data items, but from an MPAN level, you'll be expected to see the new market segment indicator, which indicates which new market segment the MPAN is now in. There's a new GEOS tariff ID, which is replacing the line loss factor class. And also from a agent point of view, you'll now see a number of newly designed agents. The data collector is being replaced by a data service. The meter operator is now a metering service, and the data aggregator has been removed. Alongside this, there's a new concept of a DIP ID, which is similar to an MPID, but it's the ID that an agent or party will connect to the DIP. That will be now included within the EES as well. And from an agent point of view, you'll also see a flag to show you whether an agent is directly contracted or not. In addition, we're now adding an annual consumption into EES, which is being provided from Electricity Central Services. And there will also be a MHHS indicator as a flag to show if an MPAN has moved into the new arrangements or remains in the old arrangements or has even been reverse migrated. On the removed side, we're no longer able to show a designation. The measurement class has been removed, which is part of how that designation is derived. So that's no longer there. And also the SMETS version is also going away. On top of that, we're no longer able to show the trading status effective from date or the RMP status effective from date, as both these items are no longer available within the interface being received from the registration service. However, we have raised a microwide half-hourly design issue to see if that's by design or if these items can be added back in and to show them back in EES. And just to flag as well that these are the new data items that will be available from the start of MHHS migration. There is a number of other data items that have been added for microwide half-hourly as of June this year, and these are already in EES, so aren't included as part of this presentation. Next slide, please, Teresa. Okay, so the first thing we're considering is how EES is going to be updated through the migration period. So what we will do is provide an updated screen layout with updated data items for MPANs that have been migrated. MPANs that are in the legacy arrangements or have been reverse migrated will show the existing screens that you already see within the user interface. As I stated, we'll show a new data item for an MHHS indicator, which will indicate whether an MPAN has migrated or has even reverse migrated. And then MPANs that have reverse migrated will continue to show the annual consumption that was calculated when they were within the microwide half-hourly arrangements. That will be static while they're back in legacy, but we'll continue to show it so that field is available for parties to use in their quotation or their forecasting. Next slide, please, Teresa. Thank you. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to run through sort of pictures of the design of EES in the order as you'd normally see them as you access the system. These are where we are currently with the design. So as I go through, I might mention that there's still some questions around some of the design, or considering additional functionality or areas. So if there's anything that you think could be added, please feel free to add it in the slide or etc. We can consider it at the end. So the first thing we're going to look at is the search screen. This is where you come when you first access the system. Now, as I said before, as we're no longer able to calculate the MPAN designation, the MPAN designation filter will no longer be available. What we're going to replace that with is the domestic premises indicator, which has been provided. So you'll be able to filter on true or false on the domestic premise indicator to be able to show either non-domestic or domestic MPANs or all of them together. This is one area where we are looking at what else we can do here, and we'll continue considering filters around the market segment, for example, to see if you can filter on if it's smart or advanced, etc. Next slide, please. Thank you. The other thing you get when you search on an MPAN is it comes up with a number of icons to show you from a quick glance attributes about that MPAN. Some of these icons will be newly added for microwide half hourly. So when we're going through migration, there's 4 new icons that will be available to all MPANs, whether they're migrated or not. And these are the icons to show whether it's been migrated. So if an MPAN is on MHHS arrangements, or if it hasn't been, or it's been first migrated. And then the other thing that will show for all MPANs is the domestic premises indicator, if that's false or true. For MHHS MPANs only, there'll be 2 new icons. One to show if the data service flag is if data service is directly contracted, and a second flag to show if a meter operator is directly contracted. Next slide, please. And then icons that will be removed, and for all MPANs, so MPANs whether they be migrated or not. As we said, the MPAN designation we can't show anymore, so that'll be removed at the start of migration, and also the old domestic premise indicator flag, which was only for true, that will be removed as well. But MPANs moving into the MHHS world, we're no longer able to show whether an MPAN is under objection, whether it's related based on the MTC, because the MTC is no longer available, or if it's export based on the LLF, because again, the LLF is no longer available. What we are looking to do is to work out whether we can derive this information from other items and show whether that MPAN is export, for example, based on the energy direction. So hopefully we'll be able to show that information, but not in the icons as they currently are. Next slide, please. Thank you. Just clear my screen. I can't actually see what the title slide is. So the next thing as you come down is the MPAN panel. Again, these small changes to this. So when in the current world, you have a line loss factor class, which is no longer there. So that's been removed. What we're going to do is replace that with the market segment indicator. And then the GWOS tariff ID will be on a field as we go lower down. Also, as you can see on here, the trading operational effective from dates are no longer shown as we discussed before. And also there's a new disconnected field. If an MPAN's been disconnected, you'll be able to see that it's been disconnected where the traded item used to be in the top right, and you'll show a date when that MPAN was disconnected. Next slide, please, Teresa. Okay, so moving on down the screen, we come to the supplier panel. Very few changes here. For those of you who use EES currently, you'll know that if an MPAN's been migrated through the new fast switching arrangements, there's a CSS switch little red eye that shows you it's been switched for the CSS. We're not receiving that information anymore, so that will no longer be shown. And also, as you can see on the screen, how the DIP ID will be shown. We're going to use a tooltip for that. So as currently, you would hover over an MPID and you would see the supplier name. When you do that, you'd also see the DIP ID for that participant, and that'll be the same for all participants that have a DIP ID. Next slide, please. Okay, moving on down to the agent panel. Again, the data aggregators have been removed, so you only see the metering service and the data service. And as you can see there, there'll be the icon to show whether it has been customer directly contracted, will also be shown there, so you'll be able to see that easily. Okay, we can move on. Settlement parameters. So with this, the MTC is being removed from legacy, and we're alongside the measurement class, and where the measurement class used to be, we're going to show the GWOS tariff ID. So you have to see that within the settlement parameters field. And then looking at the smart communications tab, as I said before, that the SMETS version will be removed. What we replace with is the meter data retriever, the MDR, which is the new service which will access the DCC on behalf of suppliers or the data service. We'll show that within the smart communications tab, along with its MPID and its DIP ID via the tooltip as I showed earlier. Thank you. Looking at the current and historic meter details, very few changes here. What we have added to what you currently see is the manufacturer make and type, and that will be added into the field just after where the number of digits are. For where we don't have that information for MPANs that haven't been migrated into microwide half hourly yet, what will be shown there is a blank field. So that icon, that item will be available for within legacy, but it'll just be blank until it moves into microwide half hourly. Next slide, please. Okay, so as I mentioned before, we're unable to show the objection flag anymore, and this is because we currently receive all of the supply registration history information direct from the Electricity Retail Data Service. We're not getting that detail of information now through the DIP, and it's not available from the registration service. So as such, we won't be able to show that in detailed information that you currently see there. So that means we won't be able to populate the objection status, the date the objection was entered, whether it was removed, and any registration notes. What we can do, what we do get from the CSS, is when a registration is being cancelled. So what we'll do is we'll show failed registrations as being cancelled. They just won't be the detail on whether it's being withdrawn or it's been objected as to why that registration was cancelled. And if we move on to the next slide, you can see the what that looks like. So on the supplier history field, where if you click on all events, you'll see failed registrations highlighted in red and the date that registration was cancelled. So you'll be able to see that information, as I said, just without the detail that is currently there. Next slide, please. Thank you. Then moving on to the MPAN relationship. So this is where currently you can see whether an MPAN is either within in a related situation. Well, what's also there's whether an MPAN is associated to an import-export arrangement. That information is still going to be there. However, what we currently don't receive anymore is the date that was set up and which supplier set it up. So that information, as we stand, won't be there. However, we are investigating whether we can derive that information from the date the file was received, etc., and be able to add an effective from date. So that will help in understanding when this was set up. Next slide, I think. Okay, so this is probably one of the more exciting parts of the new data that we're adding. So we're getting the annual consumption on a monthly basis from Electron Central Services, and what we're proposing to do is show in the web portal the last 12 months of rolling consumption, so you can see how it's changed over the 12 months, and also the quality indicator, so you can see whether it's what quality of those fully advanced, etc. that date was when it was set. The API would only show the most recent field, so you just get in this instance you'll be able to see December 23's data, but not the history of the API, but they would have that information within the web portal. If we move on to the agent history, okay, again, similar changes to what we saw in the actual agent fields above. You'll be able to see the full history as you currently can. We're adding the DIP ID tooltips into here, so you can see what the DIP IDs are, and also the customer direct contracts icons, so you can see as a supplier who the agents were contracted before when they were previously appointed, so you can see how that's changed well over time. And then as we move to meter history, again, we've just added the meter manufacturer right into this tab. Similar to, as we said before, it will be added for all MPANs when they migrate to microwide. It will be added for all MPANs, but only populated when they've moved to microwide half hourly, and it will be blank for legacy and first migrated. And then if we move on to the alerts, so currently there's a couple of alerts that you see in the system that are derived from the MPAN designation. As the MPAN designation no longer exists, these alerts won't be able to be shown. Again, what we are doing is thinking about how we can set other alerts around things like the market segment, so that we can maybe replicate this functionality, but using different items, etc., to be able to get a similar result. And if we move on, okay, so if you put all of the different tabs, etc., that we've talked through together, this is what the full screen looks like. I appreciate that it's not the best on a slide. Hopefully when you get the slide back, you can maybe have a little look at it, but it just gives you a bit of context as to how all the slides actually fit together and when you actually log onto that system and see the screen. Okay, so I'll move on to changes to the API. The API design is a little bit behind where we are on the user interface, so we haven't got any pictures, etc., to show you, but with it being an API, that would be quite difficult anyway. We are expecting to be able to share the API technical specification for industry review in August, so next month we should be sharing that, and then the legal text will form part of the micro-wide half-hourly legal code drafting. We're then expecting to make the API available for testing through the MHHS UIT sandbox, which will be planned for the 4th of November 2024. We'll also make that available to parties who aren't involved in MHHS testing. That's just the environment it'll be in, so all parties will be able to access that. And then the updated API will go live for all users from MHHS Go-Live, which is currently planned for the 4th of April 2025. Move on. Okay, so while we're designing the API, we are trying to make sure that we reduce the impact on parties as much as possible. To do this, we're following a number of API design principles. The first one is that any new data items from MHHS will be added to the end of the API payload. So there'd be an extension of the API rather than adding items in the middle of the payload. We're going to provide the same file from the API to all parties, independent of the micro-wide half-hourly qualification status. So the same API payload will be provided to everybody, whether you're involved in micro-wide half-hourly or not, or if you're qualified for micro-wide half-hourly. The means of connecting to the API will remain unchanged. And items not populated for MPAN. So if it's a legacy MPAN and it's got the new MHHS items in the API will be provided as null values. So where something isn't populated, it'll be a null value. Next slide, please. So this is a big point to all of this. So the changes to the API will impact everybody, independent of whether you're involved in micro-wide half-hourly or not. So, for example, if you're a price comparison website or something that hasn't been involved in micro-wide half-hourly at all, you will have to update your systems to receive the new API with the new data items. Similarly, if you're a supplier, say, that is intending to exit the market before micro-wide half-hourly and not qualified for micro-wide half-hourly, to be able to receive the API during the migration phase, you would need to update your systems to be able to receive that updated API. The API will change from this date for everybody who uses it. Sorry to belabor the point, but I think it's something that really needs made clear. And then looking at reporting very, very quickly. So just a very quick thing on this. All our standard reports from EES, i.e. the D&O report, the portfolio report, are being reviewed. Any redundant items will be taken off them reports, and we'll add new items that are valid for them report into the body of the reports. We also are aware that parties have got bespoke reports that they get directly from C&C Group. C&C will be talking to everybody about these reports and advising on the changes that will be made through micro-wide half-hourly to, again, either add new data items or take off data items that are no longer valid. And if we move on to the next slide, okay, I think that's the end of my whistle-stop tour of changes to the portal, and John will take you through the next steps. Thank you.
Thanks, Johnny. So this is just a quick run through of what's happening after this. So we are aiming to publish the API technical specification. I can see we've had a question about that next month in August. So those of you interested in the impacts of the API where you're using that today, that Johnny highlighted, that will be when that's available for review. And please do engage in that and review it and provide any comments at this point. We are aiming to complete the design, build and the test of the changes to the inquiry service by the end of this calendar year in December, with a view to entering systems integration testing with the programme in accordance with their timetable in January of 2024. Once we've concluded that, we will be looking to finalise our documentation and update the user guides and issue those early next year. And at that point, we will be looking to organise a further education event, which may be useful for wider colleagues within your businesses who use the service on a day-to-day basis. In terms of the testing of the API, the plan is to make that available for testing in the end-to-end sandbox phase of the programme through the UIT environment. So the UIT environment is being stood up at the end of the systems integration test phase in November 2024. So those that would like to access the API in the test environment, that is the current plan, and we'll be able to share details of that as we move forward through the programme and close to the time. And then at the moment, MHHS Go-Live is scheduled for a 3-month window between March and June 2025, depending on the outcome and the resolution of certain risks and issues in the programme today. And so that's when these changes would seek to go live. And just to reiterate the point that Johnny made, that those changes will go live for everyone, for all users, regardless of at what point you start to engage in MHHS. So we'll be looking to make that really clear in the communications leading up to that. And that was it for me. We'll hand over to Teresa for questions.
Yeah, thanks, John. So yeah, at this point, we're now going to open up for the Q&A session. So we'll have a look through obviously what you've submitted by Slido. So if I hand over to Harriet, I think who's got access to Slido, obviously we can start plowing through those.
Hi everyone, I'm Harriet Truss from the Rec Code Manager and supporting with this event today. So yes, we've had a few questions through Slido, which you'll have seen, and then I think there's just the one that's come through the chat. So I'll just take those in order of the kind of popularity on Slido. So the first question, and I think John, you're picking up this one. Is annual consumption appropriate to be shared with market participants, and how is RECO going to ensure that this is not used for marketing purposes?
Yes, so we when we updated the data access matrix, we completed a data protection impact assessment of the new data items to look at what restrictions should apply, if any, to market participants. And yes, the outcome of the annual consumption was that it could be available to the current users of the inquiry service in accordance with the current terms of use. And anyone who's accessing the service has to comply with the terms of use set out either in the REC or in their access agreement as appropriate. And there are provisions in there for managing any misuse of that. But the annual consumption as a static figure isn't considered particularly sensitive to warrant real restrictions of the types of participants that could access that in the inquiry service to date. So it's not something that's going to be published publicly for anyone to access, but inquiry services under the current model, in line with those terms of use, were deemed to be acceptable to access that.
Okay, thanks, John. So the next question is, will you still be able to see who the current MOP is and the MOP history? Same for the supplier information.
So yes, you will. Yeah, so the agent history and the supply history will be maintained, so you'll be able to see that as you currently can.
Thanks, Johnny. Another one around annual consumption, so I think back to John on this one. Adding the annual consumption is insufficient to determine what product or service a meter is eligible for. Ideally, access to a year of half-hourly data will be needed.
Yeah, so I think there will be solutions developed to respond to that in the market, but the inquiry service isn't the place for that. The inquiry service is intended to be, as it stands today, a database of standing data relevant to the meter point to support particular use cases. There are ways in which that data can be accessed. So that is, there's routes available through the DCC for smart metering directly, and I believe Elexon have indicated that it's something that's being looked at through their open data process in the future. So I expect there will be solutions coming to market to resolve that, but that won't be via the inquiry service at this stage at least.
Okay, thanks, John. So the next question is, please can you ensure all updated documentation has very clear red line changes? Previous document updates did not have clearly identifiable updates. John, I'll hand that one to you, I think.
Yes, we can make sure that happens.
Yep. Lovely, thanks. Next question is around the DIP ID display. So why is the DIP ID being displayed as a tooltip rather than including the text on the panel? Johnny, I'll hand that to you.
Yeah, so we discussed this with some industry participants within MSAG, and I think this was the preferred option to continue to show the MPID, and then the customer, the actual participant name and the DIP ID would be shown as you hover the mouse over. Just to be clear though, the API will have the DIP ID in as its own field, so it will be included in that.
Funny. There's two questions here again about annual consumption and the half hourly data. So back to John. So adding the annual consumption is insufficient to determine what product or service a meter is eligible for. Ideally, access to a year of half hourly data would be needed. I think that's the same. We've just had that one, haven't we? I will move on. Not quite sure why that one didn't move on. If access to half-hourly data for prospective suppliers is not available, then the incumbent will have an unfair advantage and the customer will have data to send data on.
Yeah, so like I said, I expect there will be solutions coming to market in relation to this once there is greater access and recording of half-hourly data in the market. I think we're a way away from the full migration completing, which I believe at the moment is due to complete towards the end of 2026. And there are other programs of work looking at it, but yes, at the moment the inquiry service it's going a step of the way. It's introducing data not currently available, and that will support a number of use cases. Fully appreciate there are other use cases that the market will need to be able to have supported in the future, and I, like I say, I expect there will be other developments outside of this coming forward with that at some point.
Okay, thanks, John. We've had a couple of different questions around access to the data items. So there was one in the chat on here about how can housing groups get the access without having to pay for the search, and we've also got one around the third-party intermediaries, someone in the role of the third-party intermediary service provider. Are they eligible for the new data fields?
So yeah, I can probably cover off a few with this one. I think there are also questions around the charging arrangements for the API as well, and questions around the data access matrix. So the data access matrix has been updated to reflect these changes. That is available on the REC portal, and we can make available a link to that with what goes out after this meeting, so people can reflect that. That, as it does today, sets out the data items that each role can access, and within that, yes, third-party intermediaries, local authorities, non-domestic consumers can access many of the new data items. There are a select few they're not able to access, such as the identity of a customer direct contracted agent, but there are but that sets out exactly which data items can be accessed and can't be accessed. And in relation to charging arrangements, none of that is changing as a result of this. So the costs associated with being a user dependent on your user type is set out in the charging statement that we publish on the REC portal. We can include a link to that that we publish outside of there. So for those who aren't currently using the API and are considering the use of it, the associated charges for the use of the API are set out in that document.
Lovely, thanks, John.
Hopefully I knocked out about 7 there.
I'm hoping so, yeah. So Alga, there's a specific question around the SMETS version. Please could you confirm why SMETS version is being removed? Johnny, I'll hand that one to you.
Yeah, so That's was a decision made by the market-wide half-hourly programme that the SMETS version was no longer required. I think it can be derived from other items as well within the MCDs, but yeah, so the programme made that decision that the SMETS version is no longer required.
Thank you. Then regarding the new EES data items, which of these are at MPAN level and which of these are at meter level? Relevant for MPANs with multiple meters particularly. Sorry.
Yeah. So I think the vast majority are at MPAN level. There's very few, especially the new ones we flagged here, that will be at meter level. I think the main one is the meter make and type. So anything that's an actual attribute of a meter will be at meter level, and then everything that's is attributed to the MPAN will be MPAN level. But the vast majority of what we've talked through today is at MPAN level.
I'm just having a quick double check on which ones of these have already been covered off. Will the new or the updated APIs be available in a rec test environment prior to go live?
Yes, that's the intent.
Just to add to that, Harriet, that was the point I made around access to the UIT environment during the end-to-end sandbox phase of the programme from November 2024. So if that wasn't clear to people, those wishing to access it in the test environment will be able to do so in accordance with those timescales.
Okay, so the next one is access to consumption information for a customer. It's the very reason for market-wide half-hourly settlement. Access to annual consumption and also the half-hourly data will be needed. I think you've possibly already covered this one off, but yeah. Okay.
Yeah, that's been covered.
Yeah. Annual consumption is provided by the ExoServe, which manage the gas inquiry service. This brings consistency. It's a good thing. Just feedback one rather than a question there, but I don't know if there's any other comment you want to add on to that one.
No, we agree.
Yeah.
Got a question on the data access matrix. The data access matrix is badly written and confusing. Can you work on improving this documentation?
So there is a change proposal that's been raised, R118, which is looking to consider revisions to the way data access is managed in Schedule 12 of the REC. So it's going to be looked at there. I'd encourage whoever wrote that, please do get in touch and give us some details around how you think that can be improved. And I think that would be really helpful for feeding into that piece of work. That piece of work is, I think, aiming to conclude potentially ahead of MHHS. So feeding in through that route may be able to address some of the concerns you have around the usability of it sooner.
Thank you. I'll just flip over to the question that's just come in on the chat. Is there a plan to allow for UPRN to be added against the electricity addresses and gas addresses, and will the future APIs have UPRN as a query parameter? Is that?
I'll leave John for that one.
So I'm just looking for the question. Is the question, Harriet, will we introduce the use of the UPRN in the inquiry service?
Yes.
Yeah. So the answer is no at the moment. It's not a data set that the inquiry service has access to. So the inquiry service sources data directly from the DNOs and the CSS today, and in the future it will be sourcing data directly from the DIP. The data has to be available via those sources to be accessed within the EES. I believe there's a lot of history behind the UPRN and the reason that's not there today, and I believe there might be some licensing restrictions around that as well. So I know it's not a particularly easy one to solve. But in relation to these changes, there is no proposal to make that data item available to the EES at this stage. Therefore, we can't make it available just yet.
Lovely. And at the minute, we've just got two more. So EES pricing and charging statements are tremendously insufficient, while the service availability is not good enough. Will you work on making the API performant?
So we're aware there are some high volume users of the API that have provided some feedback recently on this, and we're in the stages of working through that and looking into how that's done. So there's some work going on today around that. So that's a kind of business as usual issue that's being picked up through today's channels, and that piece of work will come to a conclusion separately to what we're doing for MHHS. So if that's something that somebody's raised where it's new and it's something we're not aware of from you as a particular user, do come and get in touch with us, and we can feed it into that piece of work.
Okay, thanks, John. And the last one that's on the side, and I'm aware there's a few on the Q&A section as well. I'll just do this last one here first. Would we use DIP to send messages to other MOPs or suppliers, or would we still use SDEP?
It would depend on the process. So the DIP has been introduced to allow messages to be sent for a number of purposes. I think if you currently use SDEP to do something, you continue to use SDEP, or the DIP may replace some DTM messages, mainly around appointments, I think, from a MEM point of view, and in the smart world, receipt of MCDs. But yeah, I think if there's questions around that, I'd encourage you to. There's a wealth of information on the MHHS Faculty Programme website around which processes we need, which DIP ID flows, etc. So it might be worthwhile sharing the link to that when we send the information out as well.
Okay. So the questions that have come in on the Q&A, I will just dipping into a different view. Couldn't publishing of the annual consumption and quality of the data be used to avoid certain customers with poor data history, i.e. this could be detrimental to the customer?
I'm not sure. So there will be a quality indicator to suggest what is making up that annual consumption, which comes from the MHHS design. So arguably there would be a mechanism to say whether there is estimated data or partially estimated data associated with that, but that ultimately I would be very surprised if that ended up being a deliberate outcome of a market participant. I think there would be a question around their compliance with their license, that anyone who considered that type of use of the data would certainly need to strongly question. So in terms of technically, you could say from the data, is that historically based on fully estimated or partially estimated data under the design, but I wouldn't have thought there would be a significant risk around misuse of that data to avoid particular customers. I think this comes down to a wider design question, though. That is how the design has been implemented and baselined. I think if people had a particular concern about the use of that, then it's probably a question for the wider design, and there is the opportunity to raise change requests if somebody feels that's a significant risk that would need to be plugged.
I think this next question is possibly also kind of more the settlement design, but for supplies which are not converted to a new meter and retain the traditional meters, even if the settlement structure is half hourly, how is this going to be represented in the annual consumption or other fields?
Yeah, so basically the annual consumption's been calculated by Elexon Essential Services when they get their half-hourly consumption for data service. So every MPAN, independent of the meter type, will get some half-hourly consumption, and then the Elexon will calculate an annual consumption based on what they've received. I think in that instance there, where you've got a traditional meter, you're likely to see that the estimation flag or what the quality is different, and depending on how many monthly read that's been based on. But that's how it'll be. It'll still be calculated based on the reads provided, and based on the methodology that's in the design. And then we'll be able to understand exactly how much of that is based on real reads by the estimation quality.
Okay, thanks. So there's a couple of other questions kind of along the same theme, but I think I've covered off a couple of different bits in there. So, and obviously we'll pick these up and cover them off on FAQs afterwards. So I'll move on to a slightly different question. There's a question around, will other parties be able to get access to this? I think that refers back again to the access to data is kind of determined in the data access matrix, and we'll share the link as John said for that. There's a question: disconnected or deregistered, are these distinctions made?
I think so, yes. I think yes. So basically, the RMP status will show if it's deregistered. Once it's been disconnected fully, then that's when the disconnections flag will come out.
And
Yes.
sorry, John, go on.
No, I was just going to say that's correct. They come from two different sources. There's one update that says that an MPAN has been classified as disconnected by the distributor, and then there's a separate message from the CSS that says that the supplier has deregistered from that supplier, and they are two distinct events that get updated separately.
And there's a couple of questions around the kind of the change in some of the data items. So the domestic flag, the measurement class, the LLFC. So the questions kind of on kind of what's the alternative? How are those going to be used? Do we want to pick up each of those off to kind of help people understand a bit more of the background there? Are you happy to take those questions?
I think it's worth so. Yeah, there's a question.
Okay, bro. So how will the domestic flag be set, and what happens if this won't be visible in EES and profile class is gone?
Yeah, so the domestic flag is currently held within CSS. At the moment, it's only populated within EES once the registration has happened. So when we get the data for that, as part of the MHHS data cleanse, we'll be populating the domestic indicator within both registration service and within EES before go live. So all MPANs will have a domestic indicator. They'll be able to be filtered on. With regards to the profile class, that is now only mandatory for traditional meters, so it won't be set for all meters. So again, you won't be able to use that to determine whether it's domestic or not for anything that's not got a traditional meter on potentially. So yeah, we are expecting to have the domestic indicator populated for all meters before we go live with this.
And measurement class, no measurement class, how will certain supply types be indicated? Current, transformer, whole current and capacity spheres. Okay,
so there's two new items. One got introduced in June, and the other one will be introduced as part of my quite hour. The first one is the connection type, which will tell you if something's CT or whole current, or only if it's CT, what voltage it is, if it's EHV, EV or LV. So that's there already, and that will be cleaned and populated before we go live. The market segment has been added, which will tell you whether something's in the smart area or the advanced area. So basically, the measurement class is no longer required for settlement purposes, because MPANs won't be defined by that, but instead they'll be defined by by a combination of the connection type and the market segment.
Thank you. And the line loss factor class is going from the EES portal or from the industry. Sure, there is a renaming process. The DUOS element is provided within the alphanumeric value, previously known as LLF. Is that right?
Yeah. So the line loss factor, it's line loss factor is being renamed and repurposed, I suppose. So the line loss factor that will be passed over into DUOS tariff ID. but the line loss factor itself, the line loss factor class, will not be as associated with the geotariff ID as it currently is. That line loss factor class is being maintained within MD, and the new ISD, which replaces MDD, so will be maintained within Elexon. It's just not being populated within EES, but as you say, you've got a geotariff ID which will tell you how your charging is being provided.
Okay, and the trading dates, there's no effective dates for the current supplier or the trading status. I think you mentioned this earlier on in terms of the design issue question, but I'll let you.
Yeah, so I mean, yeah, we noticed that as we were doing the design. So it's not being communicated to us currently from the registration service. So as I said, we've raised the design issue to have that considered by the programme to see if they want to reinstate that effectively from data if there's a reason for why they're not there. But if they do reinstate it, then obviously we then populate it within EES.
Okay. Teresa, just to double check on timing, how are we all good to keep going with questions?
Yeah, we've got a few more minutes. Yeah, so
Yep.
I think it's important. We've had lots of questions in, so yeah, I think it'd be good to, if we've got time, to go through some more, and probably suggest obviously that we follow these up on the Q&A with the pack afterwards as well. Lots of interesting stuff coming in.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. Just want to make sure. Okay, so next question: could the meter read be added to the APIs based on which the EAC is calculated for the month and the possible meter read date? This data is available in GES, the Gas Inquiry Service.
So at the moment, that's not within the design to make that available to the EES. I suppose technically a change is possible under the new arrangements to enable that if somebody wanted to propose a change to the message that the Elexon central systems use to communicate that. I think that change would need to go through the standard process of impact assessment, and I think it would need to be certainly in the lead up to MHHS considered in terms of any impact it would have on the delivery timescales and any additional delivery risk changing that would introduce at this stage. So I think one of the benefits of the new models I added earlier is that ideas like this certainly can be explored in the future, whereas it was much more difficult to explore that historically because the data wasn't as easily available. So I think my answer is no, not at Go-Live, but it's certainly much easier to explore these types of ideas and consider if they have merit and impact, assess them through the change process once these arrangements have been implemented. So if people have thoughts around that and think it merits being taken forward through a change proposal, then absolutely come and raise it. But just a health warning there, I suspect it may be difficult to consider these types of nice to have value add type things in the lead up to MHHS, given it's quite an ambitious and complex program to deliver.
Okay. Next question: will EES hold the alpha block value associated with the sites?
No. It's not something that I think that the EES currently holds. I think this is something that DNOs make available to suppliers on a cyclical basis and is available on the supplier's bill. But I don't think there are any plans to at the moment to include that in the EES.
And I think this was for Johnny. How will the API technical spec be made available for review in August?
Well, we're going to initially review it through the market-wide half-hourly stakeholder group, MSAG, and then we'll send it out for wider consultation through normal consultation methods. In addition, once we've agreed it from a rec point of view, it will be consulted through the market-wide half-hourly co-drafting consultation as well.
Thank you. Where will the information being taken from to inform the DPI data cleanse? DPI flag is set according to customer contract type, domestic or non-domestic. DPI being the domestic premise indicator.
The plan, I think, from our quite a valid programme is to retrieve that direct from the CSS.
Okay. Thank you. If this is being implemented at milestone 11, i.e. before all suppliers are ready to register in MHHS, how will these suppliers access the old EES data needed to register supplies?
So there'll be no change to the legacy information, or obviously if the migration is going to be phased anyway, so any MPAN that hasn't been migrated will continue to show as it currently does within the portal, and obviously the information that is there will also be available in the API, although the API will be slightly amended because it'll have fields at the end for my quite half-hourly data items, but all the information that is currently available will be available for legacy MPANs.
I think we have possibly got to the end of all of them. Just bear with me one moment. I think we've covered all the questions that have come in. I'm just going to defer quickly to Joanne, double check that she hasn't got anything else that I haven't picked up.
No, can't see anything else.
Okay. Okay, so Teresa, I will hand over to you. Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Harriet.
Thank you.
Thank you. So we've come to the end of the webinar. Hopefully you found that useful. But what we will be doing is sending a copy of the recording and the presentation. And I think with the volume of questions that we have come in, they've been really interesting, very valid, that we'll follow that up with a Q&A fact sheet for the website that can help people as well. But what we would like to do as well is if you could kindly take 2 minutes, 2-3 minutes to answer a survey. If we send it on the link within the chat, that really helps us to sort of improve for next time, but also whatever future events you'd like us to do and what other topics in the future you'd like Reco to cover. But so following that, I'd like to draw it to a close.